I think you've got to keep your options open to some degree until you see what actually happens. But I think you have to be, and I'm sure he is, well prepared behind the scenes for certain scenarios. So, you'll need to make up your mind whether, one, you're going to retaliate, B, what your response is going to be in terms of whether you negotiate, C, how you've aligned yourself with business so that you're keeping them on track with what's going on, and D, closely reading and understanding what your foreign partners are doing so that you have a sense of what the global response actually is. All of those things you need to have game plans ready to go. I assume that they have. But they don't communicate it in advance, I mean, this is a government, for goodness sake. Now I'm on the outside, it's kind of like, yeah, it's pretty difficult when you've actually got to try and discern what's going on. So, but you're pretty good at asking questions, so you can find out if you try.
But given your experience inside the department, you're confident those plans have all been made?
I don't know what they're doing now. Everything was fine when I was there. Of course, you understand, at least till the end of December. No, I'm sure.
Just pretty recently.
Yeah,
so.
No, I'm sure they have.
Can you help me to decipher maybe a hint that Johnny Reynolds was dropping last week? I asked him whether it would be worth scrapping the digital services tax to try and get concessions in terms of tariffs from Donald Trump. And he said that, I'm sure that there's a fair level that will be set. Do you think that is on the table? Is it worth making a concession on the digital services tax when Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is so fiscally squeezed right now?
Well, look, from the sounds of it, again, I don't know what's been going on that. And it all happened after I left, so just to be clear, there's no carryover. If I read what's going on in the media, it sounds like our government seems to be saying that, they're resigned to the fact that Trump's going to apply some tariffs anyway. So clearly, if that's the case, then you don't make any concessions right now. He's going to apply the tariffs. And there's a fundamental question then, once he's applied whatever those tariffs are, as to, well, okay, what do you do next? They have intimated clearly, from what I'm reading publicly, that they're interested in getting rid of digital services tax. Now, question is that tactical on their part, or is that serious? I mean, what does it buy you? How important is it to them that happen? I have no sense for that, not being in a room, but I presume that they will come back to that after these tariffs are applied. I myself would have been a bit sceptical about whether it was a sensible straight trade to say no tariffs on the UK and get rid of digital services tax. And I don't have the impression, but I don't know, that was how it was going. I mean, I think it would have been, there was a range of things that were being discussed, and so therefore it would have been some sort of package exercise. I think if you were trapped into a straight deal, which is get rid of the revenue from that particular tax, and we know what people have said that amount seems to be around 700 or 800 million at the moment, that you get rid of that to get rid of tariffs which as yet are undefined. That would be a pretty narrow and difficult deal, not impossible. But as I say, that's not on the table now. The tariffs have now been applied. So I think the question is, what's the combination of elements post-application of tariffs that would be seriously up for negotiation? If the US is genuinely interested in getting rid of the digital services tax, and I can imagine that they would be because they've been trying to get rid of it for years prior to Trump, then of course you negotiate on it. What you negotiate depends on what they have on the table. And as I say, in my view, but I'm a old-fashioned negotiator, would be, well, I'm not getting rid of your tariffs just for that digital services tax. You need to go further if I was going to do that, and then you're into the logic of a negotiation. But just bear in mind, with the digital services tax, that has been seriously negotiated for years, so there's nothing new in saying that you're prepared to negotiate on it. And indeed, the UK government had a deal with the Biden administration which sort of settled it pro tem, but I don't think there was ever any reason to believe that the US Congress would ever have accepted the so-called OECD consensus on these matters. So irrespective of what Trump would do, I don't think the Congress would ever have settled on a deal that would have resolved the issue satisfactorily. So I don't think the government, if it was considering that, it's not crossing some terrible Rubicon. There's nothing really new in that. But only people in Wonkland know that that's been the case. It hasn't made it into the general public.
What else does the UK have to put on the table now?
Well, I think it's a bit, again, you tend to think of trade negotiations as a zero-sum game because that's the way in which people talk about them. I won the negotiation. I mean, everybody wins a negotiation. I made fewer concessions than they made. When, of course, the economic benefit actually comes from the concessions you make far more than the concessions that they make, because that's the way the economic world works, but not the political world. I get that. So I think with the UK and the US, there will be elements of trading things. I mean, we still have some residual tariffs. We still have some, regulatory arrangements that affect goods and services trade that, probably could be tuned up to be both more efficient and more liberalising. And so do they. And they certainly have trade barriers. They've got trade barriers in agriculture. They have a nice, juicy 27.5% tariff on light trucks. Now, I don't think we're in the business of making light trucks, but you never know. If you got rid of that 27.5% tariff on so-called light trucks in the United States, maybe one day we could. I mean, who knows? Because that's what the market will tell you. But bear in mind that for autos, the US is kind of strutting around saying how perfect it is on autos, but that's where the big three have been making their money, in these gas-guzzling light trucks. That's why there's a huge tariff on it. That's why the United States has protected that market. That's why the United States consumer goes there. So, there's all that's up for grabs in a negotiation. Not that I'm saying that would be the key to a negotiation. We could say, look, we want fly-in, fly-out visas for our businesses to go into the US in a more liberal way, just to give you one example. It's a small thing.
Zero cost.
And they wouldn't, there are all sorts of things that you would do, and there are all sorts of things that you could do together as well. I mean, these days negotiations don't have to be a pea for you and a bean for me. They can actually relate to the real economy, and they could actually say, listen, we want to have some kind of constructive future relationship on issues like AI and on innovation. I mean, United Kingdom has an agreement with Australia, which, if you read the media, you would think it was all about beef. And sure, it's got some beef in it, but it's got an amazing chapter on innovation in terms of the cooperation between both business and government officials on innovation policy. So with the United States, with the world's biggest economy, what does the United Kingdom need? Growth. Growth is what we're after. And if you could approach your relationship with the United States that actually was a significant liberalizing agreement in areas of goods and services, then you're going to shift the dial on growth more than you're going to do with any other potential negotiating item in the future. Now, Trump says he's sort of up for that. I have no idea whether that's empty rhetoric or whether it's for real. But if it's for real, and even if it's half for real, it's the UK's interest to really seize that opportunity and say, yes, we want to pursue that kind of deal. We don't want to just find that after you've applied these tariffs, all we're talking about is how we get rid of these additional tariffs and what we have to pay for them. It's like, how do we build a bigger deal on trade and economic issues in the future? Now, I think we have every reason to give it a go. Now, it might not work, but nothing ventured, nothing gained.
But we're focusing a lot on the US here, and there's a whole world out there, right? There's also a European Union that Donald Trump doesn't seem to be very happy with. Is it realistic for the UK to be trying to hedge relations between the US, the EU, China as well? And is it actually possible to have equal, grown-up, business-like relations with all three simultaneously?
Well, not necessarily equal, but grown up is good, and I think there's a track record you can. Yes, so the short answer is yes. I mean, United Kingdom has every reason to be doing what it wants to do right now with the EU, which is to sort of tidy up some of the frictions that have been left over from Brexit and to see whether they can actually be cleaned up in a way that particularly small businesses are finding transactionally difficult. So, of course, you can do that. Now, the government's been very clear that it's not It's not interested in going back into the single market, and it's not interested in going back to the customs union. Now, if that was the case, then some things that you might end up doing with the United States, but I don't know whether you would become more difficult. But that's hypothetical. I don't see any huge problem there, so there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to tidy those things up. You already have by global standards, a very good free trade agreement with the European Union. So, I mean, from the European point of view, I don't see that as an obstacle. There are a couple of things which you might end up doing with the EU at the very micro product level that might be problematic with the US at the micro product level, but I don't see them as kind of deal breakers and showstoppers. And you should be. I mean, we're talking about the United States because we're going to have a major theatrical performance in the next little while in the Rose Garden, weather permitting. But for the rest of the world, the United Kingdom still can and should be pursuing broad and successful trade and economic agreements with the fast-growing economies of the world. So, we are, as I understand it, still negotiating with India. We're still negotiating with the Gulf. And here we're into real wonk territory because we're in an Asia Pacific agreement, which is called CPTPP, which I don't know why it's called CPTPP. I think you can blame the Canadians for that, or under Trudeau for that. But in actual fact, it's an Asia Pacific trade agreement with some of the fastest growing economies around, and there's a queue of people wanting to join it. So, we should, the United Kingdom, be really pressing now to accelerate the processes for countries to accede to that agreement so that we can get the benefits from a broad agreement with that part of the world. And we have to think about what we want to do with Brazil and Mercosur, for instance. Yeah. There's a whole range of countries in Asia, whether it's Thailand or Indonesia, for instance, which are vast growing prospects. So, of course, you have to go after all of those things. And so I see no reason why not.
Opportunities there as well. Thinking ahead, though, to tomorrow's announcement, where is the UK vulnerable? If you were in your old job and you're watching the announcement tomorrow, what would have you with your head in your hands saying this is really bad for the UK?
It's funny. I don't work for the UK government anymore, but I kind of... I still feel somehow weirdly disloyal if I was to be passing out information of what would really hurt the UK that could be advantageous to the United States. Not as if I imagine for a minute that anybody would listen to a word I say. So probably I should say.
Well, we're all listening.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think generally I would look at the whole picture. If he goes to a very high end of tariffs across the board, my head would be in my hands for the consequences for the global economy. I mean, in other words, if you've got really high tariffs applying to the European Union and Japan and the United Kingdom, and you're talking 20% plus, and it's across the board, then it's like, oh my God! I mean, this is the kind of shock you'd really be scared about, and that kind of dwarfs everything else, just simply because that puts you, that puts you in the scenario, the upper scenario that all the economists have been assessing for what the impact would be globally. Now, all the noises that are coming out of the White House are that he's not going to that extent. But I don't know whether it's true or not. Nobody really knows. For the UK, it sounds like, everybody's on the Donald Trump naughty step. It sounds like, in terms of the good students that are on that step, we might be down the good student end of that. So, if you're down at 5% or lower, is what they apply, then it's kind of like, that's still damn annoying. But I think that's reasonably survivable for the time being. Once you get above 10%, or then I think you sort of say, gee, that's something that will affect business in goods, and that's something we've got to take seriously. I don't think I'd have my head in my hands, but I think that's the sort of area that you think, okay, I thought we might have got off a bit lighter than that. Because again, if you stretch it, if you think if we're at 10, then I start to worry that the bad guys, so-called, the gang of 15 or whatever he's calling them, then presumably they're going to be up around 20 or more. So that would sort of bother me for both those reasons. But it's entirely in his hands. Bear in mind, and I think it's important, I don't diminish any of this, and the numbers speak for themselves. But bear in mind that this is goods trade, and as far as we know, services trade directly appears not to be affected, which is a vast amount of global trade. And of course, the impact will still affect services industries. And most people seem to think that goods are goods and services are services, but in actual fact, you could argue that in real value-added terms, most goods are actually majority services. But having said all that, I think it's not to diminish the fact that it's a serious attack on growth in the world economy. So if you're up at that top end, I don't think the markets are clearly going to send a message on that. So let's hope not.